Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. We're so excited to see your faces again. So it's interesting. Monday, I went to a reading story slam, another story slam hosted by NPR The Moth. And I got to see live in person one of our employees that worked like right in another building that I haven't seen in almost 2 years, so I got to see him in the flesh. So some of you I have not seen in the flesh ever, and some of you I have, but it's good to see you here on the screen looking healthy and vibrant and ready for this amazing session today. So welcome back to our 4-part Black History Month series, and this is part 2. Hosted by Extension's African American and Black Employees Resource Group. I'm Danielle Harrison Green. I'm the Institute Director for Human Development and Relationships with the UW-Madison Division of Extension, and I'm also the chairperson for the African American Employee Resource Group. Our purpose for our resource group is to serve as a resource for and foster current and future African American Black colleagues' success by sponsoring programming what happened here? Sorry, can you guys hear me? Okay, sponsoring programming, providing collegial support, encouraging belonging, and raising a collective voice related to issues that impact employees' ability to thrive personally and professionally. This year, we are co-hosting this series with the Entrepreneurs of Color support team, incorporating Black history into extension programming by sharing stories, research, and vibrant discussions. The Entrepreneurs of Color support team was formed in 2019 with the mission of supporting wealth creation through entrepreneurship within communities of color. They focus on expanding knowledge of BIPOC business ownership, developing educational programs, and working with communities, organizations, and individuals with a shared mission. You will learn more about who they are during this series and the ways that their work resonates with Black history. So why is Black history relevant to extension programming today? Well, in more ways than you may imagine, and while this series is focusing on the intersection of Black history and Black businesses, there are numerous intersections that directly applies to extension, striving to be an anti-racist institution and in a wide array of programming such as organizational development, financial education, health and well-being, land stewardship, and farming. And before we move on to our program, I would like to first acknowledge our leadership for ABERG. Rick Mills is the secretary, Catherine Borg-Smock, members and events committee, Eva Terry, treasurer, James Bowling, the committee chair for retention and recruitment, and our shared leadership for the professional development team, Jenny Abel, Randy Zagram, Heather Quackenboss, Erin Conway, and Monica Lovenstein. And finally, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge this week in Black history. Dr. Bernard Anthony Harris joined NASA's Johnson Space Center as a clinical scientist and flight surgeon, where he conducted clinical investigations of space adaptation and developed countermeasures for extended duration space flight. On February the 9th, today, 1995, astronaut Bernard Anthony Harris Jr. became the first African-American to perform an extravehicular activity. Sorry, just want to make sure my sound just keeps popping out. Okay, during the second of his 2 space shuttle flights. He was the first African-American man to go in space as one of NASA's research teams, and he was involved in the construction of the space rovers. I'll put a link in the chat so that you can learn more information about Black history. Please remember that your feedback is very important to us, and we'll provide a link to a survey in the chat box as we close out the session today. I will now turn it over to Mr. Rajan Hall.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Rajan Hall. I'm currently an advanced MSW student here at Wisconsin and entrepreneur myself. Over the past 2 years, with the support of the EOC team, I've interviewed 75 Black business owners from 2 separate counties in Wisconsin. And you'll learn more about my research next week, Wednesday, in the Black Business Owners Speak Wisconsin section. And I have the honor to introduce our next presenter, Tessa Conroy, the Economic Development Specialist in Community Development Institute. Her main focus is on entrepreneurship, how communities can support entrepreneurs, and how entrepreneurs shape their local communities. Over the last few years within Entrepreneurs of Color, the EOC team, she's started to take a closer look at businesses owned by people of color in Wisconsin and nationally. Her presentation today will focus on the current state of Black and African American owned businesses in Wisconsin, what happened during the pandemic, open research questions, challenges, and opportunities. After the movie Boss we watched together last week, the goal is to provide more local context and a better understanding of where we are today. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce Tessa Conroy.
Thank you, Rajan, and thanks so much to the resource group for this invitation. It's so nice to be able to be part of this conversation and share this work. I will say before I share my slides that I consider myself a beginner. I hope to learn from all of you today as well, and that means joining the conversation. So I know I have a tendency to keep talking, but please, please, please interrupt me. Put your comments in the chat. Mia's going to help me incorporate your discussion as well. So with that, again, I hope we can all participate today. And I will share my slides. All right. So today is somewhat data intensive. I'll try not to chart you to death, but I do want to just give a sense of what the numbers look like for Wisconsin when it comes to looking at Black and African American owned businesses. So just a sort of basic lay of the land here. Black or African American owned businesses in Wisconsin have grown substantially in number, and that's what I'm showing you in this first chart with the orange bars. And then I'm going to compare the Black or African American owned business group to other racial and ethnic categories, just so that we can kind of see for ourselves what things look like in comparison. And what you see going from, excuse me, I just need to change my orientation here. What you see going from 2002 to 2012, and I had to stop in 2012 just because the census changed their data on me, is really dramatic increases, more dramatic than for any other racial ethnic group in Wisconsin. So this is the story of, a rise of entrepreneurship, a rise of business owners of color, and particularly Black or African American owned businesses. From 2007 to 2012 in particular, we saw a 70% increase in Black or African American owned businesses. So this was a time of quite a bit of growth. While the growth, I think, is really encouraging, I want to place it in context of a parity conversation. So one way, a relatively simplistic way that we might think about parity is to say if 5% of the population in Wisconsin is Black or African American, we might also expect 5% of businesses in Wisconsin to be Black or African American owned. And then we would say, that that's a way to measure parity. And what we see is that we don't quite have it in Wisconsin. So the population here on the far left in the dark gray is Wisconsin. 5% of our population in 2012, again, I had to use the somewhat dated data just because it was the most detailed I could get, was 5% Black or African American, but just 4.58% of businesses in the state were Black or African American owned. So we have a disparity when it comes to business ownership. What's more striking to me, though, is the disparity when it comes to sales and revenue. So this is just how much money those businesses are earning. And so again, while we might expect Black or African American owned businesses to be earning 5% of overall sales in the economy, what we actually see is close to 0.5%. So a really large, very striking gap in terms of disparity between what we see in terms of the population and what we see Black or African American owned businesses generating in the state in terms of sales. This is just for comparison. We can do the same thing for the white population. And what you see here is that close to 90% of the population in Wisconsin identifies as white. I'm looking at the adult population too, so that's one caveat, population 25 or older. And yet the white population owns 92% of businesses and accounts for 97% of sales. So again, here a disparity, but in favor of the white population. So we can see where if the pie is only so big, larger chunks going to the white population relative to their overall representation in the economy. Here is a statewide county map, and this is just a really simple way, again, of thinking about disparity. So what I've done here is say for each county, what is the share of the population that is Black or African American? And then what is the share of businesses owned by Black or African Americans? And I've taken the difference. So anywhere we have a positive value, which you'll see is across the state, we have a disparity. That means the population that is Black or African American is larger than their share of business ownership. So we have underrepresentation of business owners, we could say. That's another way of saying it. So for example, looking at Milwaukee County, that's the very darkest county in the kind of lower right corner, that 5.322. So those numbers reflect something like 28% of the population is Black or African American, but just 23% of business owners are Black or African American. So this is a nice reminder, I think, that we have Black or African American business owners throughout the state. I think sometimes we concentrate the conversation to certain regions or certain counties, maybe even certain cities, but we have diversity throughout the state. And we also have disparity facing entrepreneurs throughout the state as well. Here I'm able to update the data a little bit with 2017 numbers and look though specifically at businesses with paid employees. So in all my other figures, I was looking at the sum of all businesses. So those could have been just one man or one woman shops, as well as big businesses with employees. Here, if we just focus on that bigger chunk of businesses that have paid employees, what we see is that in 2017, we're losing progress basically. So even before the pandemic, while we had growth among Black and African American business owners from 2002 to 2007, that growth really stalled for this community in a way that it did not, for example, for the Asian-owned businesses or Hispanic-owned businesses. So I think a question for me as a researcher, for us as a community of professionals, is sort of, what's going on here? What happened to this progress that we're seeing maybe in other segments of the economy that we're not seeing here with businesses with paid employees? So something to be alert to as we continue our work. Those were just some introductory figures, but several charts. So I just wanted to take a quick pause and ask if there are any questions that we have so far, or if there's any local observations. Was anything striking in terms of what you saw relative to what you see in your community? And I'll just give a few seconds.
I had a quick question about the growth part that you presented. That 2007 to 2012 is during the Great Recession. Is there any, do you have any more insight on how, or are those related?
So you're exactly right. So I can comment a little bit further in that this was a really noteworthy period for business owners of color, and that business owners of color were growing in number as well as in job creation during a time when white-owned businesses were actually declining. And I haven't found any research that really helps us understand that. So this was a story of success during very trying economic times for one community of color, and yet for several of the other demographic groups was not a story of success. And so I think that that's also an open research question of sort of what can be learned about what lent to success during that time that didn't for other groups.
Tessa, you have two questions in the chat box that pertains to the data and what, like, who is included in this data. So for example, do the business numbers include franchises, or are they all independent businesses? The other question is, does this include online only businesses like shop in Etsy, for example? And maybe you can talk a little, because I was thinking about that too, like some like the data is a snapshot, and we do know there's some undercounting going on too, right?
Yes. So there's some limitations, certainly. So these data are coming mainly from tax document sources. So any business that has over $1,000 in revenue should be included in this data source. Any business who is paying payroll taxes would be included in these numbers. Any business filling out a 1099-C should be included in these numbers. So for various reasons, maybe including documentation, the formality of the business, for example, we might be systematically undercounting certain business groups. It could also be the case that it would also be the case that I'm counting businesses, but not people. So if one person owns multiple businesses, that would make these numbers a little bit trickier to understand, which we would expect to see some entrepreneurs certainly have more than one venture. So I hope that helps.
Do you have any comment? Oh, go ahead, Sherry.
Okay, thank you. I'm not quite sure how to evaluate the numbers. So when you brought up on your map that Milwaukee has 25% Black population, but 23% Black businesses, that seems fairly close. I'm wondering, what you make of that versus other parts of the state.
Right.
So I'm just not sure how to evaluate those numbers at all.
It's a really good question. And I would say it varies a little bit depending on the source I look at in terms of how they evaluate disparities. So one might argue that we actually, rather than take the absolute difference that I did, where we ended up with that 5% difference, that we would want to take something more like a ratio. Well, and by that, I mean, okay, what is the ratio of 23% to 28%? I'm not great here off the top of my head, it's something like 80%. So we're 80% of the way there to parity. Maybe we would look at a different county in Wisconsin and just 1% of the population identifies as Black or African-American, and only 0.5% of Black or African-American owned businesses or of businesses are Black or African-American owned. So the gap is 0.5%. But if you calculate it as a ratio, then we're only 50% of the way to parity. So it's kind of it's somewhat up to interpretation in terms of how you want to think about disparity. In my sense, there are multiple ways it's being measured that I see in reports and literature. And that's going to affect how big or small the reader sees the gap. So I went with absolute numbers just because I thought they were perhaps the easiest to understand, but certainly ratios and other tools are going to help us understand the proportion of that gap.
Thank you.
Other comments? I think I'll move on. All right, thank you guys for those questions. All right. So Black and African American business ownership is crucial to wealth accumulation. So with my first few slides, I just wanted to give us a sort of light lay of the land. And here I want to talk about why this is important. Why do we care? Why are we talking about this? There are, of course, lots of answers to this question. The economist in me went with this one first for this presentation. So here we see that Black-owned businesses could be essential for closing the Black-white wealth gap, and that entrepreneurship and business ownership can be a mechanism for social mobility and wealth accumulation. A report by the McKinsey Consulting Group found that the median white family's wealth is 10 times the median Black family. So we're talking about really large disparities. And they also find that this gap costs our economy between 1 and 1.5 trillion per year. So it's very expensive in terms of lost economic opportunity to have these gaps. And they attribute 300 billion of that gap specifically to differences in revenue between white and Black owned firms. So just by achieving parity, so if we had Black owned businesses earning a parity share of sales and revenue, we would expect upwards of 300 billion of kind of new wealth creation in the economy. So really substantial figures to be thinking about in terms of how this could matter for individuals, for households, and for our communities. I have links to these sources as well on the slides if anybody is interested. So thinking about why it's important, I also want to take a look at just sort of more recently what's happened during the pandemic. And what the literature points to is that the COVID-19 pandemic was likely most challenging for Black or African American owned businesses when we look at racial and ethnic groups. That is because Black and African American owned businesses have the largest share of their businesses in vulnerable sectors. So things that tend to have to close, retail, restaurants, personal services, these types of activities. And so those were more severely impacted than other industries. These businesses were the least likely to have employees, and that had implications for getting access to resources, as well as the savings that allow you to weather a downturn. Smallest average sales, again, a very similar argument. Going into the pandemic, these businesses were the most likely to be financially distressed, the least likely to be profitable, and had some of the lowest credit scores. So for that reason, even going into the pandemic, businesses were already vulnerable. And then when this downturn happened, had perhaps a harder time weathering the storm. But there is some good news here, which I have saved for a little bit later in the presentation. So what does this mean for Wisconsin? What are these figures saying? So the first feature or characteristic of Black or African American owned businesses that I want to point to is that most have no paid employees. So what I'm showing you here in blue are the number of firms with paid employees versus the number in orange, which is the number of businesses without paid employees. So it's upwards of, I think it was 95% of Black or African American owned businesses are these one-man, one-woman shops with no paid employees. That certainly entails a certain amount of flexibility, but it can also imply, or we tend to find correlations that these businesses are lower earning, have lower savings accumulated, and all of that can make it more difficult, again, to weather that economic downturn. So the small size makes these businesses perhaps more vulnerable with the onset of a challenging few years. Black or African American owned businesses are also concentrated in the sectors most vulnerable to the negative impacts of COVID-19. So what I'm showing you here are the 4 sectors that were sort of hardest hit by the pandemic. And then what share of businesses for each racial or ethnic group were in those sectors. And what you see is that for the white business owners, just over 30% of businesses are in these very vulnerable sectors. But for Black or African American owned businesses, upwards of 55% were in these vulnerable sectors. So when the pandemic hit, Black business owners were much more likely to encounter those sort of severe negative effects that we saw. It makes it more difficult to survive a downturn. Here again is sort of a different way of thinking about the size differences. So white-owned businesses are 3 times more likely to have employees than Black or African American owned businesses. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at non-Hispanic white-owned businesses, and what you see is that 19%, I'm going to round up and say 20% of businesses have employees, whereas for Black or African American owned businesses, that number is just 6%. So you see this very systematic difference in terms of the likelihood of having employees reaching that sort of critical size, where maybe you have a few more tools at your disposal, some flexibility for surviving a downturn. It also can mean greater access to things like some of the loan programs that existed during the pandemic. And so these size differences end up really mattering when it comes to survival.
Tessa, do you have a moment just to answer a couple of questions that came up? Well, Dominic was asking about the 1 to 1.5 trillion gap that you were talking about with associated costs of not reaching parity and doing all these other things to create more equity. he's saying, can you talk about the costs associated with the 1 to 1.5 trillion gap, or rather the adverse impacts of the gap? And then we have another question after that too, if you're okay taking those.
Sure. So I'll try to expand a little bit on that wealth gap. So the wealth gap would include things like differences in cash savings, would include differences in home value, as well as differences in what each population has in terms of business equity. And so in my mind, the way I've been thinking about this lately is, when I read the literature today, at least in economics, which of course has limitations, it kind of takes the wealth gap as given. So there's a wealth gap, and that can be challenging for entrepreneurs of color, and in particular, Black or African American owned entrepreneurs. I think what is important to keep in mind is the historical context, which we've been learning about and talking about together, and that that wealth gap is of course the result of decades longer of differential treatment, violence, asset devaluation, barriers to property ownership, barriers to education. And so if we want to understand where entrepreneurs are today, I think we need to understand all of that context so that we can more fully appreciate the barriers and more systematically work to correct those as well. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Tessa. And then Monica is asking, could you give some examples of what would be included in other services? It was a previous slide.
Yes.
That looked like a big category.
Yes.
And Dominic, saying thank you to you.
Yes. Other services is a big category. So if memory serves me, it's things like personal services. So I believe like barbers and hairdressers would be in personal services. If I'm remembering right, childcare would be included in other services, but also it's quite a smattering. So things like machine repair are in other services, dating services are in that sector. So it's a really broad array. And I should have given some more examples. So thanks for raising that question. All right.
We're up to speed, so you can keep going.
All right, great. So here's another way of thinking about the small size of businesses owned by people of color, and in particular, Black or African American owned. You see average sales per firm on the y-axis here, and we have average sales per firm. These are in thousands. So I'll just keep it simple, $1,000 on average for Black or African American owned, less than half of what it would be for for white owned businesses, for example. Another way of thinking about this, and I should have included the size, is that for every dollar earned in the average white owned business, the average Black owned business earns 65 cents. So if you're familiar with like a gender wage gap, so women earn, let's say 92 cents on the dollar for men, if we were to set up a comparison of similar similar terms, we would be saying that the average Black owned business earns about 65 cents for every dollar that the average white owned firm. So in terms of talking about equity and percentages, I think that's really striking and really large. Okay, I think what is interesting though is that those businesses that do have employees are comparable to white-owned businesses. So a lot of those gaps that we saw tend to fade when we get into businesses with paid employees. So another way of saying this is that a lot of the data that I'm looking at, I'm including businesses of all sizes. One of the features though of Black or African American owned businesses is that they tend to be smaller. They tend to be just one person. But if Black or African owned businesses get to the growth stage where they have employees, they perform relatively comparably to other racial and ethnic categories, particularly non-Hispanic white. So we're still seeing a gap here, but in general, as Black or African American owned businesses advance to these larger size categories, some of the gaps go away. So to me, this could be an opportunity for programming. It's kind of helping entrepreneurs in these small size categories advance and grow, because we see, again, those disparities shrink as they reach higher levels of size, both in terms of employment and sales. So I find that really encouraging. So in sum, Black and African American business owners were more vulnerable to the negative effects of the pandemic. So we saw that they were disproportionately concentrated in the sectors most negatively impacted by COVID-19. In addition, we saw their small size. So they're much more likely to operate without paid employees. We call those non-employers. And their non-employer status can make it more difficult to secure a loan, to weather a financial downturn, and to incur the cost of doing business during COVID-19. So these costs, as we maybe all saw, it might include touchless technology, extra sanitation, online platforms, social media training. All of those are expensive for business owners. And if you're already in a position where you maybe have not accumulated much savings or are sort of getting by month to month, week to week, these extra challenges become quite burdensome and quite cumbersome. I want to give a more concrete example, though, of kind of how these challenges can play out for business owners. So even though, for example, the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP program, there were not explicit barriers for small businesses, the incentive structure can be such that we systematically disadvantage certain business owners. So here's an example that I see of that. So for the Paycheck Protection Program, lenders earned an origination fee equal to 5% of the loan balance for loans under $350,000. And that percentage that they earn on the loan goes down as the loans get larger. So even with that in mind, though, if we think of a loan of $40,000, a lender would make just $2,000. So for a small business to engage with them, to provide financial services, to work with them on a loan, yields a relatively small payoff. And yet we see large businesses, something like Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, they got sort of roasted in the media, received something like $20 million in PPP lending. And a loan that size is going to yield $200,000 in fees. So much more lucrative to serve these big businesses. So if it's the case that a certain population is disproportionately in the small size category, then even though we don't have explicit discriminatory language built into the program, we still end up systematically perhaps excluding or disadvantaging owners of small businesses, and those might be people of color in this case, or are people of color in this case. So we can see how, I just want to kind of draw attention to how these challenges are connected of small size and access to resources. But even before the pandemic, I want to highlight that Black and African American business owners were especially underfinanced. So here we have just some statistics to mull over. So 58% of Black-owned businesses were at risk of financial distress before the pandemic, compared to 27% of white-owned. These are mostly reports done by the Federal Reserve banks, if any of you are interested in the resources. Black-owned businesses, Black-owned business owners are more likely to indicate difficulty accessing credit. We also know that marginalized groups, including Black business owners, are less likely to receive full financing when they apply. And all of this despite the fact that 30% of Black owners of employer firms hold an advanced degree, which is true for only 22% of white peers. So sometimes we might see the argument out there that, well, it's hard to know whether Black or African American business owners are as competitive as candidates for lending. And without really detailed loan data, it's difficult to answer that question. But this sort of cursory statistic suggests that highly educated employer businesses applying for a loan would come in with financial records that would make them likely in a comparable or similar position to other business owners, yet we see these really large gaps in terms of financing. So I just wanted to sort of put those two things in juxtaposition for us here. So what does all of this amount to? All of these challenges during the pandemic with size and financing Ultimately, we saw that Black or African-American self-employment declined the most during the pandemic. So compared to our other racial or ethnic groups, Black and African-American owned self-employment declined by 40% in the first month of the pandemic. That was really striking. That's compared to 22% overall for all other groups. What I think is really interesting and tells a very different story is that the Black self-employed also had the strongest recovery. And you see that here in the later months that I'm showing you. So April is the first month in the sort of darkest orange or brown color. So that's the biggest decline. Then you see self-employment start to come back with each subsequent month, May, June, July, and by the end of the summer and into the fall, we actually see Black self-employment rising above what it was going into the pandemic. So really deep decline followed by a really accelerated increase. So what's going on here? In Black communities, small businesses surged during the pandemic. So those first few months were really rough for everybody, but especially for the Black self-employed. And then we saw this sort of a renaissance of entrepreneurship that was especially true in Black communities. So following this initial decline, entrepreneurial activity more than recovered. And there's some new research. There's an interesting article in the New York Times that I've linked to if anybody's interested. Areas with a larger share of Black residents had higher rates of business formation during the later months of the pandemic, especially in high income Black neighborhoods. So it seems to be the case that this surge of entrepreneurial activity coincided with federal spending programs. So the pandemic potentially had a number of effects. We had initially a lot of people facing unemployment. We also had people in a very different financial position than, say, the Great Recession in terms of more generous unemployment benefits and more generous stimulus dollars flowing into households. And then also potentially too, the pandemic seemed to give a lot of people pause and inspiration to pursue a new line of work. And these factors seem to combine together to create this new, like I said, renaissance of entrepreneurship or rise of entrepreneurship. That said, it then makes it difficult to untangle whether this rise of entrepreneurship that we're seeing across all demographics, but in particular for people of color, is this about necessity entrepreneurship or wealth creation? You know, is this people pursuing entrepreneurship partly out of desperation because their employment has gone away or they don't feel safe at what was their past employment position, so they need to find something else? Or is this a story about new opportunity, about wealth creation, about growth of new businesses? And to be honest, we just don't know. It's kind of too soon to tell. I did want to pause here though, and I think the rise of entrepreneurship during the pandemic, which again was true across all demographics, but particularly Black or African American business owners, is surprising to some people. But I just wanted to pause and ask, you know, what kind of new businesses did we see during the pandemic? Do you guys have any examples of in your local community of what we saw nationally in terms of lots of new entrepreneurs?
Tessa, are you referring to just any type of new business or
Yes.
specifically BIPOC? Okay. Yeah, my family is an example of one. So my partner worked at a community center, it closed, and he thought of, you know, accessing the cares. But as a small business, it was overwhelming, and there wasn't like, yeah, I think the statistics that you pointed out about, you know, there wasn't going to be the return for the financial lenders for the business that we had. So started their own, and it was rough.
Mm-hmm.
Going.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing lots of, thank you, Trisha. Also in the chat, I'm seeing lots of food related businesses and lots of online activity or online businesses. And that's definitely something that's reflected in the data too. Online retail was the #1 category for new business activity during the pandemic. And I just continue to be intrigued by the innovation, particularly among food businesses. My sister lives in Washington State, and they relaxed their alcohol serving and selling regulations in the state. And so several of the restaurants were then able to innovate along those lines. So I think she said that they had something like a tequila truck every weekend, and that you could get margaritas with your tacos, for example, delivered right to your door, and the truck would come to their streets and that sort of thing. So lots of innovation there. Lots of people, yes, doing online consulting. So professional services was another huge area of growth during the pandemic, where we saw people taking their services online, perhaps consulting as again, that one man or one woman shop. It was really a lot of this new entrepreneurial activity during the pandemic. Personal training, lots of creative work, pop-up businesses. A question here, do you have any sense of how much of this business growth is a primary earning business versus a side hustle? If memory serves me, 70% of these sort of new ventures that are maybe just one person state that their goal is for it to be their primary income. I think at the time of survey, something like for 30 to 40%, it's their primary source of income. So not everybody, but also a non-trivial share.
Tessa, before you move on, Sherry asked earlier on when you were talking about the racial wealth gap in terms of earnings, the 65 cents, she's asking, is the 65 cents to $1 earnings disparity related to the client base served, or are you saying it's size related? And would you mind also repeating the differentiation between the gender and the race gap when it comes to the dollar?
So I was just trying to, first with the gender wage gap versus what I'm seeing here for businesses. So we hear a lot about the gender wage gap, and it's just something people are familiar with. So I wanted to give us that comparison. So, you know, something like, I haven't looked at it most recently, but women earn 92 cents on the dollar for every, or 92 cents for every dollar earned by a man. So we have that sort of wage gap, and that's, you know, arguably, you know, too big. But then when we look at what we have for the earnings gap among business owners of color, and it's even more striking. So that's why I was saying the average Black owned business earns 65 cents for every dollar earned in the average white owned business, just to give us a sense of, wow, we thought the gender wage gap was bad, and here we have an even larger gap in terms of business sales and revenue for people of color. That gap, though, is attributable to potentially many things. So it could be related to size. So it could be that Black or African-American owned businesses are just smaller in general, so they're going to earn smaller sales. It could be related to sector, that Black and African-American owned businesses are in lower earning sectors. So for example, wholesale businesses tend to have some of the highest earnings, and we don't see very many people of color in that sector. Instead, they tend to be in a lot of service sectors with lower margins. And even though I think the sectoral and size difference help us understand the gap, I think we should be thinking about what sort of systemic features of our economy incentivize starting in one sector or another. If Black and African Americans on average face greater wealth gaps and more limited access to financing, their ability to start a business in a high earning sector is going to be much more limited. Accessing that level of capital is just going to be really difficult. So I think it's important to keep in mind those, again, sectoral and size differences, but also be asking why those exist in the first place. All right. Oh, Miles has the most recent numbers for those of you interested in some of these data gaps. So thank you, Miles, for including those in the chat. All right. So, oh, all of the messages stayed up on my slides. I suppose that's not a big deal. Again, so I've already sort of hinted at some of how I've been thinking about this research. Again, I'm a beginner. I'm trying to identify what are the most appropriate research questions going forward and how to best answer those. I mentioned that oftentimes in the economics literature, we kind of see this wealth gap taken as given, and there's really not much discussion of the historical factors that contributed to the wealth gap. And what I'm just trying to suggest here is that we think together about, okay, we observe these disparities in business ownership today. Why do those exist? So we'll guess there's a wealth gap. Well, what helps us understand the wealth gap? And that moves us backward in time. So thinking again about asset devaluation over time. So that's something along the lines of how systematic racism or racial bias, for example, lowers the value of homes in predominantly Black neighborhoods. So we have that lower asset valuation, and then how that contributes to a wealth gap. Barriers to education, things like the GI Bill. So going back quite some time, or even rather as recently as the GI Bill, created barriers to education for people of color. Lack of institutional trust. So one of the documents that I was reading that I've linked to at the end in case others are interested is about entrepreneurial ecosystem building specifically for Black and African American owned businesses. And one of the themes from that document that I think we hear in our work on the team is the lack of institutional trust. Well, where does that come from? Of course, decades longer of barriers to property ownership, violence. We saw in the video, the destruction of Black Wall Street as just one of many examples of violence. We saw the importance of Black banks. And so I think one of the features of Black banks that is really important is that it more naturally perhaps lends to institutional trust where there hasn't been, particularly with banks where we've seen historical practices of redlining. So there's a lot to think about here. I know for me, I'm still trying to learn the full breadth of factors to consider, but also make connections across and between and understand how that tells the story of business ownership today for communities of color in ways that are unique that we wouldn't see if we were to just be focusing on the statistics on business ownership as a whole or looking at the white population. With that, though, I wanted to give an example and then turn it over to you. So we had already talked today about the Paycheck Protection Program. And one of the features of the Paycheck Protection Program was that it was run through banks. So people access these dollars by working with a bank with their application. Alternatively, we could imagine a program that was run through credit unions, or maybe a program that was administered by the IRS or by our economic development corporations. By running it through banks, people that had an existing relationship with banks were at an advantage to get those funds. And what we know is that people of color are systematically less likely to have an existing relationship with a bank. And you see that here in this graphic. So these are funding sources used over the last 5 years. And we see that for Black and African American business owners, they're just much less likely to work with a bank compared to our other racial and ethnic categories. So again, even though there's not a systematic or an explicit discriminatory language by working with banks, it necessarily becomes the case that certain groups are going to have a systematically harder time accessing those funds. And where does that weak relationship between banks and people of color come from? Well, again, I think we need to be looking at historical context, and that's just one of the things that I'm trying to understand better as a researcher so that we can better understand and address the challenges that exist today. And I just had another example. This is just, again, I'm a beginner, but I watched 13th not too long ago. And so understanding the extent to which our criminal justice system disadvantages people of color, Black or African American men specifically. And then we see this paycheck protection program where the language is written such that people who have been involved with the criminal legal system have less access to funds. Again, even though there's maybe not explicitly discriminatory language, what that does is disproportionately affect a particular community of color. So making these connections across kind of historical context and the programs we see today, I think is really important for understanding the world that business owners of color are navigating. And then again, I just wanted to open it up to others and ask what you're thinking about. Are there other historical factors that come to mind that could help us understand the struggles or the successes of Black or African American owned businesses? So again, I brought up criminal justice system. I've brought up assets evaluation, strained relationships with banks. Are there any other factors? And I'm especially interested in those factors that you see leading to greater success and some of this surge of entrepreneurial activity that we've seen in most recent years.
I think this is an additional complication. It's not really a success factor necessarily, but some of the Black business owners I've worked with are thinking of their target market as other Black families who they know are majority lower income. And so they're trying to price what they do at a point where those particular families could afford it, even though it's not what they as the business owner need to be able to continue for a very long time. So just how they're thinking of themselves as a way to support their community and provide this important service or product is counterproductive to their success in business. And it's so hard to talk through that because I totally get what they're doing there, trying to be charitable, but at the same time, if it's my job as a business development educator to help them have a profitable business, talking them out of that or out of that as their main target market is important. So but it's so real to be able to do that. You have to understand the context of how they're thinking and relating to the people around them and wanting to be of service to their community in a really specific way.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. That kind of how entrepreneurs think about their markets. And again, I think that comes from somewhere. I mean, I can imagine a lot of reasons, but perhaps they don't perceive much opportunity with their white community members, for example, that the market for them is really within other Black or African Americans within their community. Somebody brought up highways. Yes, K through 12 educational system.
From my understanding of some of the history of Black business and then today working with Black business owners a lot in my own work, I do feel like a lot of times the values that are attributed in starting a business may look very different from, if I'm completely generalizing, a white-owned business. A lot of times the family legacy is really important to provide role models to your children, to the rest of your family, to uplift your community. It's a lot more than an extractive kind of capitalist, I'm going to win it, winner takes it all kind of model. It's a lot more, to me, community oriented than what I see in, generally speaking, white business owners. And I think that has a lot to do with history and understanding, the importance of working together and, having each other's backs with all the discrimination that's happened or is still happening.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, ma'am. This models and mentors comment, I just want to elevate because it speaks to some of what I've been reading about recently. entrepreneurs tend to lean so much on other entrepreneurs for accessing information. So the more entrepreneurs you have that you can connect to, the better. And to the extent that the entrepreneurial landscape has been dominated by white men, that creates challenges for other categories of entrepreneurs, and that our networks are still somewhat separated and not all that integrated in some ways. So for women, for people of color, for Black and African American entrepreneurs, accessing role models and mentors who share an identity can be certainly a limiting factor.
I just had a crazy question that popped into my head, so I'm going to ask it. Can't keep those in there. Does the maybe gross overzealous wealth accumulation part of the data skew some of this to really understand the importance of these other things like community? And, you know, when we have exceptionally large wealth in some areas, the wealth gap gets gigantic, and maybe is that part of the data that really makes it hard to understand what it means to be family supporting? I don't know if this thought isn't perfectly thought out, but I'm thinking of the, you know, the billionaires in the world really throw off our understanding of what it means to be an entrepreneur and wealth in some ways.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I fully understand your question. So feel free to interrupt me, and we can always talk about it more at the end. I do think oftentimes our narrative around entrepreneurship is dominated by a sort of particular stereotype, oftentimes maybe looking like the sort of Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. And so we sort of lose sight of the entrepreneurs in our community who are contributing to quality of life in rural areas, who are making a living for themselves, who may have just a one-man or one-woman shop that is run out of their basement or out of their van or whatever that may be. And so I think, you know, I like to think, or hope to be agnostic about entrepreneurship, that all of these types of folks really count as innovators. They're doing something differently. They're doing something to, again, make a living for themselves. And hopefully what is presented maybe in the media or through some of the major narratives we hear doesn't take away from the entrepreneurs that we're working with, you know, every day in our communities.
Well, one local in Madison that kind of comes to mind is, you know, JP's Hair Design, right? He is a barber, owns a barber shop that does that, and he's a community builder around, you know, bringing in health access to the African American community and other things that are what people were just suggesting is like when you're working with these entrepreneurs of color, that maybe being a billionaire isn't their first thought. It's about how we can better our community. And I just wonder how that fits into the research you're trying to do and the data that you're, you know.
So certainly motivations differ, you know, for all entrepreneurs, but we even see systematic difference. I think I have done the most work on women. So women's motivations for becoming an entrepreneur are very different than what we would see from mainstream. And I think Diana and Rejan will be able to speak into those particular motivations from their qualitative interviews and what they heard from the people that they were speaking with, in terms of it's not really about the money in a lot of cases, and giving back and legacy and community are often all part of the narrative. And so it's not just like this profit maximization story. And so I think, again, that's a limitation of economics. We tend to think about things in just one particular way, but it's a much richer story to tell them that. I just have a couple more comments here. I know we're out of time. So maybe I'll just leave these for people to mull over. And I know that the recording will be available. There are some things we can do that have been explored already. So I'll just highlight, you know, addressing financing. I have some examples here of different things that can be done to make financing more accessible. programs that increase supplier diversity, anchor institution leadership in terms of things, places like hospitals, focusing on working with Black-owned businesses for procurement, for example, can be a great type of program. One thing we've talked about on the EOC team is wraparound services. So oftentimes when working with a business owner, it may not be enough to just help with the loan application, that developing business skills around marketing, that addressing any challenges at home, such as providing childcare, that for an entrepreneur to thrive, they're really maybe going to have a number of different things addressed and opportunities created, skills built up in order to see success just by addressing kind of one pinpointed problem. We shouldn't expect to see big changes. It might take, again, these wraparound services. And I just wanted to highlight broadband and digital equity, that so much of this new activity has been happening online. And I think what we know about access to broadband inequities when it comes to digital services can also help us understand, again, we need to make a connection here across fields, across topics, and understand that that likely has implications for entrepreneurship as well. So just a few examples here of things to think about at the end, and a lot of resources for those interested. Thank you again for your time. I went a little over and I apologize, but thank you all for your participation and comments. I really appreciated getting to learn from you too.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. Well, wait, maybe Danielle, did you want to say a couple parting words?
Okay. Hi. I'm sorry. I was trying to flip and move things around, but yeah. So yeah, thank you once again for joining us this afternoon, everyone. I just want to remind you that we have another session. As Mia mentioned, next week, Black Business Owners Speak Wisconsin, a holistic understanding of the African-American entrepreneur in the state of Wisconsin. If you self-identify as African-American or Black and are interested in joining ABIRD or consider yourself an ally and would like to strategically support the work that we are doing, please contact Catherine Borg-Smock or visit our SharePoint site. Also, a member from our professional development committee will place the link in the chat for you to complete a quick survey if they haven't already. I think I saw it. And this survey is extremely important to us as we use the data to help us strengthen the work that we do in supporting our African-American and Black employees and bring awareness to our allies. So again, thank you. On behalf of ABIRD, we'll see you next week.